Paul talks, if you want to look in Galatians chapter 1, because I'm not going to be looking at it right now because they're going to be blowing up a balloon. Galatians chapter 1, about a third of the way in, he talks about there being a perversion of the gospel. We talked last week about what the real gospel is. Now, the real gospel is what's found in actually the Song of Moses, Deuteronomy chapter 32. And that he's very, very careful to point out that these guys that are coming in and teaching, telling they're not teaching a different gospel. They're teaching a perversion of the gospel. If you're reading it, and I shut my Bible, do you have that verse there where it talks about the perversion of the gospel? Anybody? 1:7? 1:6 and 7, I think it is. Yeah, call to not, which is not another gospel, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. Okay, so we're not talking about even these guys that are teaching a different gospel. They're not teaching a different gospel. The way we're taught to read that, okay, the way we understand, they're perverting the gospel. You have the gospel, and they're perverting it. I wonder what that did to the microphone. Does that make sense? But that's not what it's saying. That's not the perversion of the gospel. Your eyes are open. Emily? The perversion of the gospel is more like this. Take the gospel here. S-P-E-L. Perversion of the gospel is more like they're just taking pressure and they're putting pressure on it. Does that make sense? So it's coming out skewed. It's not looking quite right. Does that make sense? So the subject that we're dealing with in Galatians predominantly is the issue of circumcision. And what does it take to get into the kingdom? What does it take to be part of the kingdom? Do you have to be circumcised to be part of the kingdom? Well, some people are saying them come in and say yes. That's a perversion of the gospel. Circumcision is part of the gospel. It's part of the scripture. It's part of the Torah. It's being misapplied. The scripture is being skewed. Making sense? Everybody's falling asleep.
Where's his next badge? It's blue.
Okay? So we want to make sure that what we're dealing with. So what Paul does next through the book of the Galatians, through the rest of chapter 1, is he gives a little bit of his credentials, who Paul is. And he takes you back into Acts chapter 9. And he talks about how he used to be the bad guy. He used to be the guy that was taken off after. In Acts chapter 9, he's talking about how Paul was the guy that was given permission from the high priest to go to all the cities around and gather up all the Christians and persecute them, bring them into judgment and try them for blasphemy. Here's the problem with that statement. Who were the Christians? They were Jewish. There were no Gentiles at this point. There were no Gentile believers. They were all Jewish. In fact, they were going to the synagogues to do this. That's kind of twisted from what we understand. He went persecuting the Christians. No, he went persecuting the Jews, the Jewish people. Okay? In Acts chapter 9, he's talking about how he was going after the disciples. All right. So then he's on this way to this place called Damascus, and you guys know the story, right? He's riding along, and this bright light shows up, and he gets knocked to the ground, and he hears this voice and saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It's hard for you to kick against the goads." Now the goads are they're the cattle prods. If you wanted the ox to go in a particular direction, you would take the goad and you would stab it or poke it in the quarter shanks or in the heels to get it to go the direction you wanted to go. So in some of the oxen, if they were kind of cantankerous, they would kick against them, which means you're just driving it. It's a goad is a pointed stick, so if you're kicking against it, you're driving it further into your body by doing that. So it's not really a smart thing to do. So Messiah is saying to Paul, Paul, why are you being so stupid? You're persecuting now. Interesting, because there's two different words for persecute in the New Testament. One is means to pursue, and the other one needs to put pressure on. Okay, and it's important to know which one Messiah is saying. He's not saying, why are you putting pressure on me? Because really he's not. He's actually pursuing after him. So there can be almost kind of a double meaning in this. Why are you pursuing after me? He could be saying, is he pursuing after the Messiah? Is he pursuing after truth? Is he pursuing after knowledge and righteousness? Or is he pursuing after this evil to overtake it, to hunt it down? And so it's almost posed in a sense of a question. Paul, what are you really doing here? What are you really trying to accomplish in this? Later in 1 Corinthians, Paul said, I think it's 1 Corinthians, I can't remember now. He says, I was crazy. I was just out of my mind when I was doing these things. I had no idea what I was doing. He says that in one of the epistles. But anyway, he comes to he's blinded by this light, and he's brought into Damascus. It's interesting because there's it's what's considered there is a conflict, a possible discrepancy in Scripture. This is one of the errors in Scripture that they talk about, because in Galatians 1:17 it says that immediately after he went to Damascus, then he went to Arabia. And in Acts, it doesn't say anything about going to Arabia. In the Greek text, Arabia isn't the proper noun. It's a common noun. In fact, it's neuter. It's not a Arabian is opposed to Arabias. It's not a major thing. And so Arabia means basically darkness, obscurity. And so it could be that it could just simply mean that he went into hiding. Matthew's checking the Hebrew, right? What is this?
Can I get a balloon?
No. But anyway, in the Greek, it's not a proper noun, so it could just mean that he went into hiding for a while. He ended up staying in Galatia for about 3 years. He ended up staying in Damascus for about 3 years, and was learning and studying, and then winded up teaching there. And then things got so hot for him, they had to get rid of him. He had to leave, and then he went to Jerusalem, and he met with Peter and James. And I'm almost out of time. 4 seconds. He met with Peter and James, and then Barnabas. That's when Barnabas took him on, and they went off on the first missionary journey after that. At the end of the first missionary journey, they end up coming back to Jerusalem for the Jerusalem Council that's found in Acts chapter 15. And that's very, very critical. That's really, Acts chapter 15 is what Galatians is all about, because they went to this place called Antioch. And in Antioch, some guys showed up saying, guess what? You had to be circumcised in order to be part of this club. In order to be a believer in the Messiah, you had to become a Jew first, had to be circumcised before you could do anything else. And then they went, and Paul and Barnabas are saying, no, that's not right. And so these guys, they were a sect of Pharisees. They came from, they'd come from Jerusalem and were teaching on this basis. And so that's why Paul and Barnabas said, well, I'll tell you what, we'll go back to Jerusalem and find out what's really going on. And so that's why you come back to Acts chapter 15, and you have what's the council at Jerusalem. Any questions on any about that?